when you tell me you've pushed the record button.
Pressing the recording button. Screen share
Very
is
good.
correctly. So, Ian, the floor, or in this case, the screen, is yours.
Great. Thank you very much. Welcome to everyone who has made it here, 10 o'clock on a Saturday morning, to the opening workshop of the first Candelaria event. My thanks first to Pat and Paul from Arts and Crafts for putting this all together and for asking me to be involved. I'm very pleased to be able to speak with you today. My topic for our workshop is the goddess Bridget and her worship and work among modern pagans. So I've started with a personal image of Bridget that I have used for my own devotionals for some years, showing her harp and cup and hammer and her fire and water. And we'll be talking about all those themes as we go. But for now, we'll stop that share. And for better or worse, you can see me instead. I'm going to guess that most of you who come into a room for a workshop like this don't need a long paragraph on the fact that Bridget is one of the most frequently mentioned, maybe widely worshipped goddesses in our neo-pagan revival. Certainly the most widely worshipped of what we might call the Celtic gods. Her presence extends well beyond groups who identify themselves as specifically Celtic. I'm an example of that in some ways. My own, I'll start at the personal if I may. My own involvement, personal spiritual involvement with Bridget begins with my days in Celtic Wicca, and never mind that many people will tell you there is no such thing nowadays. Back in 1981, we freely used the term Celtic Wicca, by which we meant Wicca focused on Celtic gods and customs. So the Wiccan or witchcraft tradition, they still argue about whether they're Wiccan or just witchcraft. The witchcraft tradition that I initiated in 81 or so was busy Galifying themselves. And this was pretty early for that, 1981. So-called Celtic Reconstructionism was barely smoldering at that point. And it was in this very traditional, closed, copy the book by hand sort of coven of witchcraft that I was first exposed to the Book of Invasions. I mean, I knew that it existed. I had read the Toyne, I had read the Mabinogi, and I was interested in Celtic lore. But this group began my journey into a direct relationship with the Irish or Gaelic deities and forms. And that, of course, included Bridget. Perhaps the reason that Bridget is so widely noticed out in eclectic paganism land is that her feast day has become, for better or worse, one of the 8 holidays of the witch's year, and therefore the larger neo-pagan year. I won't tell the story in detail, but I'm going to guess that many of you know the story of the invention of the eightfold wheel of the year by Gerald Gardner and Ross Nichols, who would go on to found the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids, OBOD, and take the eightfold wheel into OBOD with him, just as Gardner took it with him into his witchcraft. And, Gerald and Ross were nudists together in the British Midlands down there, and spent weekends in their little cabin in the nudist camp working on folklore, both members of the Folklore Society, busy inventing the wheel of the year that would become central to the ritual practice of the neo-pagan movement. And, you know, I guess I'll kind of start, and I'm risking my dignity and your time because I'm pretty much doing this without an outline. So if you have questions based on my lately structured talk, um, unmute yourself and make an or put something in chat. I'll watch chat. There I am watching chat now. And I'll answer your questions. Otherwise, I'll pause occasionally and ask for questions. But we can start kind of where Pat was with the February feast and the Indo-European provenance of the month of February and the holidays that are in it. You go back past Iron Age Indo-European culture, early Rome, what little we know of the North Celto-Germanic culture, and things just vanish into the mist of pre-literate history. So things about European paganism come into view for us largely through the early literate pagans, Indo-European pagans, in the Greek and Roman cultures, who once in a while actually wrote stuff about what they more or less called religion. And so we have a little bit to recover from them. So we know that in Indo-European culture, the spring is the new year. Rome celebrated its new year sometime in March, sometimes on the calends of March, sometimes on the Ides of March, approximately the spring equinox. Equinoxes are not easy to discern without a telescope and calculus. So they never got the kind of attention that solstices did in the ancient world. But the spring equinox remains New Year's Day, the folk New Year's Day of Iran at this moment, because the Indo-European Persian New Year was spring equinox. And that trend continues certainly into Rome, where before January was invented by Julius. I think that's right. I think January was invented by Julius in his Julian calendar reform. Spring equinox-ish, or sometime in early March, was celebrated as spring equinox. And that was the date. And incidentally, calendars being what they are, that means February begins the season, and anywhere south of the middle of a giant continent, like Ohio is, February can be the beginning of spring, in fact. Certainly in Southern Europe, certainly in Gulf Stream blessed Ireland, February can be the month for breaking sod and preparing soil and sowing early seed. Here you would have to get the flamethrowers out and remove the 14 inches of snow from the sod before beginning. So we just don't get to be that close to British culture. But throughout much of Indo-European Europe and Eurasia, the February begins the freeing of the waters from ice, if they ever get iced, and the awakening of the land, the awakening of our first cat. Inevitable here on Zoom. Hello, kitty. We may get my kitties. They like to come look at the screen, but I think the door is closed now. And especially in preparation for the rites. I'm sorry, this is the no outline problem. And one of the most important things that happened at spring in those cultures that remembered and kept the spring equinox was the rekindling of ritual fire. Um, a little further north, say in Gaelic territory, that custom got shifted a little later in the year, and we see it happen at Beltana among the Gaels. But in Southern Europe, spring equinox was the date when when the Vestal fire in Rome, for instance, that the Vestal virgins kept, was the feast where the Vestal fire was extinguished and rekindled. And all of that required the utmost ritual purity. Um, Fire and the ritual fire, and even your hearth fire at home was a symbol of purity, was a symbol of cleanliness. The hearth, keep a clean hearth, is a metaphor that extends to the idea of being a good housekeeper, but literally meant do honor to the hearth fire, keep your hearth clean. So the Vestal virgins, who we have the most, as a cult of women keeping a sacred fire, we have the most information in the Indo-European world about the Vestal Virgin. There's no one-to-one with Bridget's girls at Kildare, but the most information we have is about the Vestal fire. And they, of course, every day walked to the sacred well and carried back clean, flowing water, live water, that was appropriate for cleaning the bricks of the Vestal fire altar and the floors, etc., of the Vestal temple. And once a year, they made a special effort. We'll talk about the Vestals later because there's a couple of cool parallels to Gaelic stuff, even if it's a bit of a cross-continental reach. So the February season becomes associated with the work of cleaning in preparation for the big renewal. In Rome, and again, I'm just forced to rely on Europe's most literate pagans for a number of examples. And of course, if you're concerned, remember that Romans, or more specifically Latin, is the closest cultural cousin to Celtic languages in the Indo-European world. They're right next door. Bow means cow in Gaulish and Roman. There's just a bunch of mutualities that don't come from borrowings. So February for the Romans included the February 14th-ish feast called Lupercalia, which was all about purification and involved there. Now, the only thing people ever remember about Lupercalia is that, how does it go? Young men ran naked or nearly naked through the streets, and women whipped them with lashes of goat skin, or is it the other way around? Either way is funny. But that's the only thing that ever gets mentioned in popular books about paganism, about Lupercalia. But there were a variety of purification customs, and the whole Indo-European complex. And here I'm just going to have to dive right in to the gender divisions that exist in Indo-European law. Tough look. And the whole complex that exists about the woman as keeper of the house and hearth fire. It is easy to see the traditional division of labor and authority in patriarchal culture as entirely disempowering to women. But culture to culture in the Indo-European world, the amount of actual social or even political power that women were able to wield varied widely. And one of the places that women retained social influence was in the role of priestess. And every woman, here's that limb, I'm walking right out, every married woman keeping a hearth in the ordinary way was herself a priestess of her own hearth fire. Modern people inevitably think in terms of symbols. When we say to ourselves, the fire is a symbol of the goddess of the hearth. Well, that's not what the ancients thought, as far as we can tell. They thought the fire was itself a deity. That fire there on your bricks was Vesta in person. So, in the same way that ancient Europeans washed their idols and dressed them in real clothing of noble cloth and treated their idols of the gods as though they were persons, the fire in your hearth was due that kind of attention as well. So the power of the woman of the house, you know that wife is just a Saxon word that means woman, which is why the real phrase is, I now pronounce you man and wife, not I now pronounce you husband and wife. Husband means caretaker. So you're saying, I now pronounce you caretaker and woman. If you say husband and wife. If you say man and wife, you're saying regular English. I now pronounce you, he's your man, you're his woman. Got it? Got it. Never mind, I digress. And once a year, in many Indo-European cultures, the goddess came around to judge your housekeeping. It is entirely possible that and I don't think there's examples of this, but I may be wrong, where committees of priestesses literally came to your house and gave a blessing and, quietly checked the corners. I don't know. There were certainly cases like that where living wise ones came to the home and delivered a seasonal blessing. And it may be that happened as part of Imbolc celebrations among the tribe. We can't, that's speculation. But the purification and preparation for the renewal of the fire brings us right back to the calends of February. That is the first day of February. In the old Roman pagan calendar, the first day of every month was a religious feast day, the calends of the day, of the month. And the calends of February was the beginning of a season of purification throughout the Indo-European world, but, given calendrical variations. And this brings us to one of those points where you just can't tell. I refuse to use the word steal for the process of social influence that leads to the Catholic sacred calendar resembling the pre-Christian sacred calendar. That's like, I say this all the time if you listen to me, that's like accusing someone of stealing, a GAC chord pattern for folk songs. Accusing someone of stealing the 12-bar blues. It's just, religion is cultural art and custom that passes in a way that does not require management, and in fact transcends management, often happens despite management, attempts at management, as was pretty obvious for the Roman Church. I mean, the Roman Church tried for a while to beat pagan names for the days and months. They tried just putting number names on the days and other stuff. They failed utterly. We still call our days by remnant pagan god names. So these things can't be managed in any rational way. So the fact that the feast of the purification of the Virgin falleth 40 days after Christmas on the 2nd of February is somewhere between coincidence, synchronicity, sacred continuity, and somewhere along that spectrum. And one of those cases where we, from our distance, where we pick up on folklore in the 16th or 17th centuries AD, cannot tell which way the influence runneth. We cannot tell whether we keep Candlemas as a festival of purification, or even Imbolg as a festival of purification because of the Catholic calendar, or whether they do it because of us. From this distance, we cannot say. Just because the one source is older than the other, the fact is we are drawing our lore from modern folklore largely, no later than the 15th, well, no later than the 16th, and more like the 17th and 18th centuries, 1600s. You know, people actually writing down what poor people thought and believed. It didn't happen a lot in the Middle Ages. It only happened after the Renaissance, which gives me a chance to revert to ideas that may be some of the oldest root ideas I'll get to about Bridget. And I warn you here that I am speculating on a mythographic pattern that I have isolated for myself by my reading and thinking over the years. And that was, just to credit where credit is due, that was crystallized for me by an all-day talk given by one of our priests, Fox, on Indo-European fire customs some years ago. I see Bridget the goddess, and we'll get to Bridget the saint, but not for long. I see Bridget the goddess as an expression of an Indo-European trope around sacred fire and water. We'll get to Bridget's wells as we go, but because I'm going to talk a lot about fire, I'll start by reminding us that Bridget is remembered in the landscape primarily through her sacred wells that dot Ireland end to end and extend well into Western Europe as well. I personally believe that in the Catholic conquest of Gaelic countries and Celtic countries, the church realized that the sacred fire was the most important symbol the people had, and they made every effort to demonize that particular sort of thing. And I think actually the monks in Ireland were told to just leave it out. The abbots just wouldn't have it. Don't write about what they actually did. Every time I'm going to digress. Every time in Irish story you walk right up to what a Druid ceremony would look like, you just go to the next morning. It's just like Morgan Llewellyn books. So I think the abbots were responsible for that. In the Indo-European world, of course, sacred fire is one of the most central and important symbols of divine power in human ritual. We'll just take a walk. Starting all the way east in Vedic cultures, the central Vedic ceremony is the fire sacrifice, in which a fire built of the proper woods, lit at the proper time with the proper spoken words, becomes the god Agni, Agni, you've heard that name, who is called the priest of the gods, who carries the sacrifices to the gods, and is himself a deity present there as the ritual fire. Agni is accompanied by a priestess whose name is going to escape me at this moment, or by a corps of priestesses. And in the Indo-European range, if you go west just a little into the Persian, what's called the Indo-Iranian range, you still keep the masculine fire, but for whatever reason, the importance of the female figure as keeper of the fire, and this may have to do with the ubiquity of the hearth fire compared to the occasional nature of ritual fire, of like sacrifice fire. The the female keeper of the hearth fire becomes more and more identified with the fire itself until by the time you arrive in Iron Age Greece, you have the goddess Hestia as the fire itself, existing both as hearth fire and as the fire of sacrifice. Just to make this real clear, and this is a factoid that's pretty widely known, depending on what audience I'm talking to, in traditional Indo-European ceremony, the ritual fire, the fire into which sacrifices will be given, is always lit from the hearth fire of the sponsor of the ritual. You know, in the old pattern, some rich guy sponsored a sacrifice, and a sacrifice was essentially a medium-sized pagan festival. In the middle of it, there was the big altar. They kill the cattle in the morning, cook them all day, serve them to the public at night. There was free food and drink on the chieftain, sometimes for a month in Gaelic. In Celtic, like we have the best evidence of this physically from Gaul, where we have sacrifice grounds, and create a perimeter, throw up an earthwork because they had plenty of slaves, throw up an earthwork, define the festival grounds, and have a week-long sacrifice fest or month-long sacrifice fest, and see how much free meat they can give away. That fire was always to be lit from the hearth fire, properly kept and properly kept purified by the de facto priestess of the house, the ruling wife, the leading wife, whoever that was in the indistinct social arrangements of the day. So they're intimately connected. The ritual fire and the hearth fire, house fire are always intimately connected. And by the time you get to Rome, then again, just like Greece, typically Rome stole half or more of its Iron Age religion from the Greek settlers that were there when Rome was just a shanty town. Becomes Vesta, the hearth goddess of Rome, and the Vestal cult in Rome was essentially the cult of the hearth fire of Rome. The Vestal temple and the Vestal fire was considered the hearth fire of Rome, and the Vestal virgins, quote unquote, Vestal maidens, they were in fact celibate and chaste, so they were Vestal virgins, were the sacred housewives, if you were, that is, women of the House of Rome. And it may be, taking all that in hand to look at Gaelic culture, it may be that the tendency to personify the sacred fire as female continued right up into Gaelic lore, more or less as, certainly in the person of the goddess Bridget, who is plainly among Gaels that kind of hearth fire goddess. While we're on archaic stuff, there's one thing about the Vestal cult that really pushed my button about Bridget folklore. All right, coffee's not hot anymore, but tough luck. The Vestals in Rome kept a number of sacred gewgaws for the city. They had a closet. It was a sacred closet. It was behind the fire, and they only opened it at certain moments, and it had sacred stuff in it. And one of the things it had in it was the fascinum, which was a big, probably not that big, probably that big, old phallus. Romans carried and displayed phalluses as protection against the evil eye of envy. You can work the associations out for that all you like. That's what they did. And the Fascinum of Rome, they actually had a facsimile of the fascinum, that was hung beneath the chariot of the victor when the city gave someone a triumphal procession. You know, a triumphal procession was a literal ritual processional event in which somebody was honored as a hero and drove through the middle of Rome, surrounded by dancing maidens and music and all the usual crap, brass bands. They had brass bands. And so in order to ward off the evil eye of envy, the biggest fascinum in Rome was fastened under his chariot. And once a year, during the season of purification, the Vestal virgins would bring out the fascinum from its sacred closet and leave it next to the fire overnight. And there's a whole story that Fox told that escapes me now, that if this was a really a workshop about this, I would have looked up, but about someone, well, the upshot is that they looked for footprints in the ashes in the morning. And there's a story about a thief or seducer that takes it, that steps it down from the god of the fire, visiting the goddess of the fire, or anything as obvious as that. But it remindeth me of why we put the wand with the briogue in the briogue custom. I usually, because I can see people, I usually ask people to indicate with a movement of your head whether you know what I'm talking about. With the Bridget, the custom of the Bridget's bed, and they put the inevitably but not explicitly phallic wand into the Bridget's bed with the briogue, and then they look for the tracks of something, some appendage left in the ash overnight. So that appears to be a nearly one-to-one custom correspondence between this odd bit at the Vestal Temple and Gaelic households. But it gives me a chance, since we're still here in archaic land, to talk a little bit about what we might imagine we know about the pre-Christian goddess Bridget before we get to the saint. It ain't much, let me tell you true. Bree in Irish means rising, exalted. It can mean treasure. That same three letters BRI can mean treasure. It's one of the words for treasure. When it means treasure, there's two words for treasure in Irish: brie and bua. Brie, or for wealth or power. Brie is intrinsic power, a thing's essential nature. Bua is accumulated wealth or power or honor. So Brie especially refers to that within that allows us to rise up and shine, if you will. So to translate Bridget's name as the High One is reasonable. It is an inference, but it is reasonable, and it's that Indo-European root that has led modern people to use the term the High One. My beard is unruly today, I can't help it. To call Bridget, our neo-pagan goddess Bridget, the High One, very often. We see her name then maybe earliest in the Gaulish and or Gallo-British tribe called Brigantes. And here I'm out on a limb, and I cannot prove to you in an Indo-European linguistics fashion that the Brigindu, which is a proposed name of the tutelary goddess of the Brigantes, I cannot prove to you that Brigindu, hundreds of years later, occurs in the Book of Invasions as the goddess Bridget, daughter of Dagda. But the linguistics is very suggestive. The Brigantes were a powerful, widespread Gaulish, Celtic. I'm going to spare you the lecture on why I'm hesitant to use the word Celtic real freely, and go ahead and use it pretty freely. The Brigantes were a widespread Celtic tribe with holdings in Western Europe, like right on the edge of the sea, and in Britain. They were probably the dominant tribe in sort of middle Britain for a long while, and with holdings in Ireland as well. So, you know, we propose to ourselves, us reconstructors, that Gaulish tribes tended to worship a primary goddess based on either land features, especially water sources, rivers, and wells in their, but especially rivers, in their territory. There is a river Bree, spelt B-R-E-E, like where the hobbits go nowadays in England, but that's a linguistic stretch. I make no claims based on that fact. But that Brigindu might have been that kind of mother or sovereignty goddess of the Brigantes. Makes plenty of sense to me. Anyway, I lack the total archaeological and literary formula to prove it at this moment, so it's a hypothesis, not a theory. So we see that name Brigid first occurring in the monkish literature of early medieval Ireland. And we must just deal with the fact that everything we know about Irish quote-unquote mythology is bits and snippets included in the writings of the first and second and even third generation of monks, who were the first literate people in Ireland. I would normally ask for a motion of the head to tell me that you know what the Book of Invasions is generally. I'll summarize by saying that the Book of Invasions is a medieval pseudo-history composed in an effort to line Irish folk history up with biblical and classical history that the monks were learning through the church. And as you go through the Book of Invasions, it becomes obvious, and they start to talk about in the time of this king in Europe, and it was like that here. But in the very earliest phases of it, they recount material that there's every reason to think preserves important elements of Irish religious story or mythology. My own imagination about the Book of Invasions says to me that monks would have come into the monastery from everywhere. That, you know, the recent converts who were willing to actually move into the monasteries, which is how Christianity was first presented in Ireland, was as a monastic religion, and take up the disciplined life, would have come from all kinds of tribes and would have brought with them all kinds of variants of these stories, and the same gods under various names. and different versions of who's wife and who's mom or dad in these stories, because that stuff, there was never an Irish Homer. So none of this stuff was ever nailed down by a pagan thinker, even on the level that Homer does for the Greeks. And so all of these monks had to sit together in a scriptorium and come up with what the stories were going to be. And there's a principle there. You can find it in medieval Irish poetry that one of the jobs of a poet is to reconcile stories. And so it would have been natural to them to attempt to reconcile biblical stories with their hearth material and ancient mythic tales. And that's what we see in the Book of Invasions. And the argument continues about what percentage of it reflects actual pre-Christian story. The answer certainly being some. We just can't put a percentage on it from here. Oh dear, now see, it's 11:15. So we first see Bridget under that name, arriving in Ireland in the boats with the Irish gods called the Tua de Donnan, the tribe of the goddess Danu, or the nation of the goddess Danu, or the nation of the people of the gift, or whatever you think Danu means. Or Donnan, whatever you think Donnan means. And Bridget is presented in that set of stories about twice ever. First, in a simple list of who's who, the chieftains of the Tuatha when they arrived in Ireland were, and her name gets mentioned there, and called the daughter of Indagda, the Druid king of the Tuatha. They had a Druid king, a war king, and maybe even a farming king. But Celts weren't like hard monarchy or hard monarchists, as you would think of a later medieval king. And more importantly, she occurs at the end of the Second Battle of Moytura, when the gods finally defeat their ancient enemies, the Fawara, and become the rulers of the world. In fact, when the son of Bridget, whose name is Ruadan, which more or less means the red one, and reminds me, for whatever reason, of one of Dagda's titles, Ruad Rofesha, is killed in the battle, and Bridget is said to have sounded the first keening in Ireland. If you know what keening is, it's the ritualized wailing that mainly women do at funerals. An Indo-European custom that goes all the way back and has connections to some really weird stuff that we won't get into here. But Bridget, yes, does that make Bridget a goetic goddess? That's the question. because she invented keening, Amber says yes. And that's about all they say about her. At one point, she is wed to Bress, the unworthy enemy king of Ireland in the middle of the narrative. And I don't know whether Ruadan is his son or not, but it's her son, and she weeps for him. And that's all we see of Bridget the Goddess in the pre-Christian, the so-called insular literature of the Celtic Isles. Now, well, that is all we see in the literature. Everything else after that becomes a reference to the Gaelic Saint Bridget. Oh no, I'm sorry. Before moving directly to Saint Bridget, let me mention the other literary mention of Bridget, which is not in the sense in a narrative, but rather in Cormac's glossary, so-called, a monk whose name we know because he wrote a book, created essentially a gloss on Old Irish words in the Middle Ages, at a time when Old Irish was at least becoming Middle Irish, and when monks were probably speaking more Latin than Irish on a day-to-day basis. So to help translators, Cormac created Cormac's Glossary, where we actually get quite a lot of cultural context as such documents go. And he talks about Brigid, the healing goddess, with her two sisters, who are goddesses of poetry and smithcraft. And it is from that single reference in Cormac's Glossary. I should have things like dates on these, but tough luck, you got Google. That we get the idea of Brigid as a goddess of arts and inspiration. If Brigid had been such a goddess, that would put her in an Indo-European line that goes back to the Vedic Saraswati, the goddess of scholars and musicians, sitar players, and other people doing complicated inspiration jobs. And as we come into a discussion of the medieval cult of Brigid, we can kind of see her in two major aspects or manifestations. And really, the one that really counts in Gaelic folklore is Brigid as the caring mother of hearth and home. All the way back to that material on the woman as sovereign in her home or at her hearth. We must look at Brigid. Brigid was a midwife. This Brigid, this medieval Saint Brigid, and whatever percentage of her is a memory of the goddess, was, for instance, a midwife. And there's a story that the angels came to her on Christmas and whisked her away to Bethlehem. And she is, in some stories and poems, called the midwife of Christ, assumed to have gone on the angel's shoulders to Bethlehem and been the woman at Mary's side at the birth of Christ. So that's how important she became considered among the Gaels, and how important her mothering and comforting and rescue functions became among the Gael. She was said to a Bridget's cross on your house was said to prevent fire. How much time have I got? I have two good stories about that. I'll try to tell them quickly. The first is, to summarize, we here at Tradara had a terrible house fire back in the year 2001, and our house burned to the ground, nearly to the ground. Half the house burned to the ground. But the half that didn't burn to the ground was the half that had a Bridget's cross over the door between the hallway and the living room. And the fire, the destructive fire, not the smoke, but the destructive fire, oh, there I am, real big and stuff. The destructive fire stopped there at that door where the Bridget's cross was hung. So, you know, is Bridget the goddess of our house? Yes, she is to this day. But in a less dire narrative, one time at our Druid Wellspring gathering, back when it was being held at Brushwood, we arranged for the big Saturday night offering. We built a little hut, a house. We built a frame of 2x2s, and we put we painted walls of cloth and put walls of cloth on the frame, and arranged carrying sticks and hung a basket in the center, and in the basket we collected offerings of silver and crystal and currency, if I remember. There's paper currency in it, some amount. And that house, in keeping with certain Celtic customs that we know of but do not understand, was to be burned entire that evening on the big old fire in the roundhouse at Brushwood. So we did. It was the only time we held Saturday night Druid ritual in the roundhouse at Brushwood, but we did it, and the roundhouse fire team thought it would be fun to burn a big object on the fire, so we got to do it. And we did, and we put the big object on the fire, and lo, the cloth walls burnt readily, and the cloth holding the basket in place in the center burnt readily, and the offerings spilled into the fire. But whatever, and like I was watching a watch. But a half hour later, the stick structure of the little hut had barely seemed scorched. And someone said to us, says they, "Hey, there's a Bridget's cross up over the center of this hut." And lo there was, it was perfectly reasonable that someone would have nailed a Bridget's cross that they had with them to the center of the center beam in the top of the thing. So we literally took it down and took the Bridget's cross off it and put the thing back into the fire, at which point it just burned. Probably it was plenty hot by then, but at that point it just burned. So I offer nothing but actual support for the notion that Bridget will protect your house from fire, and suggest you put up a Bridget's cross if you're worried about it at all. Bridget, the goddess of the hearth, becomes this mother of protection, of food. You know, February is not a great time for food in an agricultural winter situation. The bacon was gone sometime weeks ago, and you're having porridge without bacon for the nth day in a row until the green herbs come back to shoot again and provide some vitamins, until the little animals start to stir again and put a little squirrel meat in the cauldron. You can be pretty, the resources can be pretty thin at Imola. So Bridget is the goddess who fends off hunger. At 6 minutes of 11, I just have to decide which direction to go next. That goddess of poetic inspiration, we don't see much evidence of in the Middle Ages. We do not see Irish poets making a big deal out of even Saint Bridget. She just kind of, that figure, again, may have been too pagan for, it's one thing, you can't stop women at their hearth from keeping their February cleaning customs and bringing in the Bridget's bed and doing these simple homely things. It was never the way in Ireland to persecute that sort of thing. For whatever reason, the church never undertook to persecute that sort of thing heavily, or call it witchcraft, particularly. So they continued, but perhaps Bridget, the goddess of Smiths. Smiths were suspect all the way into the Middle Ages. Smiths were in league with the devil in folk stories across Europe, still are today, if you ask me. So that figure of Bridget, the inspirer of poets and the inspirer of art, kind of returns in our neo-pagan Bridget, and has probably gotten more attention from us in the last 30 or 50 years than had been done for a long time prior to that. But the Bridget, the foster mother, Bridget, the friend of women, Bridget, I was reciting lines from her famous invocation, was an important figure throughout the Gaelic world, including Scotland. A lot of this Bridget the Hearth Goddess lore comes from Gaelic Scotland, and is simply paralleled by or paralleled from Gaelic Ireland. But Bridget, the goddess of the hearth, or spirit of the hearth, saint of the hearth, was just as popular in Gaelic Scotland as in Ireland. Gaelic Scotland, the lowlands of Scotland, probably, and by probably I mean I don't have a map in my head, probably include the old country of the territory of the Brigantes. So it's no surprise. So Bridget appeareth in modern neo-paganism from these literary sources. And because she's a friendly goddess and really pretty much a nice goddess with almost no rough edges in her whole oeuvre, she is readily taken up, has been readily taken up as an object of worship by modern people, and in typical neo-pagan fashion, conflated with the goddess or whatever. Like, Bridget is not really an earth mother. There's nothing about her that makes her specifically, she's not about the soil and the crops in so much. She's about cooking, but she's not so much about that kind of earth mother stuff. She's not particularly about fertility. Nobody's not about fertility. Everybody dies without fertility, but she's not particularly about fertility. She's about the house and its comfort and which is different from the earth mother. Earth mothers are kind of scary and dangerous usually, really, and Bridget is more like a welcome to guests, if you will. And so I got 15 minutes, so I'm going to do the weird part of this. And so a few years ago now, it looks like nearly 10 years ago now, when I wanted to undertake an experiment in spirit conjuring, I decided to begin with the work. I'm looking at, somebody asked me about Briga warriors. The truth is, I don't know anything about the word Briga as meaning warrior. I've never heard that. I mean, somebody could take it from the Brigantes, the tribal name, and it's not impossible that it had that connotation. British words for war are words like, include words like bell. That's one of the parallels with Latin. Bell can mean, in European languages, bell can mean beautiful, bell can mean bright, bell can mean warfare. And in Irish, the word for battle is cath, C-A-T-H or C-A-I-T-H. So I know nothing. I cannot confirm, and therefore would be inclined to deny, but cannot actually deny, that Briga has a reference to warriors. Bridget is often, Bridget, the Romans identified British goddesses who we think included Bridget-type goddesses as Minerva in the Interpretatio Romana. The Roman Minerva, in many ways the mother, the political mother, like the equivalent of Athena, the political mother goddess of Rome, often depicted with an orb and spear, like a queen. Seems to have been associated by Rome with goddesses like Bridget, if Bridget was in fact the sovereignty goddess of the Brigantes. And you see how easy it is to come to actual conclusions about these matters. We must, which is why it's much better to invoke the spirits and ask them who they are. than it is to try to put the puzzle together out of the dismal scraps we actually have of literature and archaeology. So I have become interested some years ago in the part of pagan magic in the ancient world where magicians conjured spirits who weren't gods, but who were able to act in magical fashion for magical intentions on the conjurer's behalf. There's lots of examples of it available in records of late classical magic. And I wanted to give it a go inside both the ritual structure and mythic structure that we were working with in our Druidry, our ADF Druidry. And so, because Bridget is such a nice goddess, and I'm not even being sarcastic, I decided we would begin by attempting to contact, one hesitates to use the word servitor, to contact, the turn of phrase I came up with were members of Bridget's spirit court, assuming that mighty deities are generally surrounded by spirit servitors, or, again, we're going to skip a lot of the metaphysics here, friends, and you can say thank you later. And that those servitors or members of the spirit's court could be conjured by mortal magicians for aid and support. So we tried that with Bridget a couple of times, several times really. The most useful thing that I think came out of that for a general discussion of this sort is the work of approaching Bridget on a practical magic level through three persons or expressions of the goddess. If I were, and I in revealing how the sausage is made, I have to go to the less pleasant parts, perhaps. But what I mean is archangels of Bridget. In an old, and here I'm off topic, except for the topic I'm on. In traditional conjuring, one works your way down the hierarchy from, God, through archangels to angels to, if you're going that low, to aerial spirits and elementals, who are the people who are down where the rubber meets the road and who can actually do magical results for you. So we did that in the conjuration of the Court of Bridget. We we made a big sacrifice to Bridget at the front end. We gave 9 offerings and sang for half an hour, and then conjured these three persons of the goddess, who it came to me, or I invented, or whatever you like, somewhere between inspiration and invention. They came to me as the harp, the cup, and the hammer. On Klarsha, on Kua, and now this moment the Irish word for hammer is escaping me. I can go look for it. But we invoked those three persons of the goddess, obviously in her three inspirational functions of the harp, as the power of poetry, the hammer as the power of shaping, the power of the smith. And incidentally, I don't think that the original text identifies Bridget's patronage as blacksmithing as such. And we always try to remember silver and goldsmithing for Bridget, because the Celts were the finest goldsmiths on the continent through the Iron Age. And the third, of course, the cup, I understand as the vessel that delivers the healing brew. And so the cup, which on this picture is represented by the traditional drinking bowl, the quaish, represents the healing function of Bridget. So on a practical magic level, when I, at this point, and some of us who have entered this pattern, invoke Bridget for practical magic, we may well be calling upon these persons. And you know, in the work that we did in the Court of Bridget invocational working that we did, we went right ahead and asked for spirits to reveal themselves to us right down at the ground, spirits who could help us with specific kinds of tasks and work. And we did, in fact, you know, instead of putting a 10-year-old boy in front of the crystal ball, which is the old traditional way to do it, I put the entire crowd at the festival ritual in trance and asked them to come up with, you know, a spirit apiece or whatever really came to them. And so I think out of that first rite, we got about 18 spirits, names, and forms. And we did the rite again in California later the same year and received another 11 or so names and forms of spirits. And I happen to know that at least some of those minor spirits are still working on people's altars inside ADF. And maybe outside, because I'm selling the book to everybody. Here I've done 0 plugs so far. All of this is contained in my Court of Bridget grimoire, available on my Lulu sales site, where you will find the rituals to accomplish this at home if you're ambitious. You know, it's a full conjuring, so it's not 2 candles and a sheet of notebook paper. And the full kind of journal accounts of the original workings as well. So you can find those and do all of this if you like. I don't have any good. I'm sorry. I was trying to come up with a philosophical conclusion to that section. I don't have any. Let me set something up here. I promised us a prayer. So let's see if we can just do something. It is still the season, you know. So we can oh, you'll never be able to read that if you're on a telephone. Just a minute. Better. So, if you are willing, and because Bridget is the chiefest goddess of our house, and it is always proper for me to see to her honor and worship, if you'd like, you may join me in Come on. You may join me in reciting, and you can't group recite on Zoom. So you'll just have to do it at home based on this handy text. Oh, wait, that's not a primary invocation of Bridget. Do you know that Bridget is the goddess of beer?
I
This
did
has
not.
to
That makes
do
sense.
this has to do with the delight of the first grain. And the whole reason to bother growing grain, bread is nice, but beer makes the world go round. It may be that we started growing grain in one place so that we could make enough beer. Bridget is the goddess of beer, and there's a famous-ish story of her turning her bath water to beer. So this charm, which I will not take us through unless the room is full of brewers, is specifically asking Bridget to bless the beer. I can come up with something different than that, however. I might have been ready. Yeah, it's going to have to be this. I hope you can read it. If not, you can repeat after me. So just join me for a moment, because an invocation without an image is in many ways half a thing. So let us put up an idol of Bridget in our vision's eye, in whatever way is true and real for you, but perhaps as an honorable and worthy woman of the house, a chatelaine, keys at her waist, the book of her housekeeping on her knee. And Bridget, of course, with her harp and her hammer and tongs and the cup of her healing, which I like to see being held in her right hand, bubbling and steaming with the heat of her fire. And if you wish, you can look into the eyes of that figure and feel that she sees us as well. And in asking for her blessing, we might say, Bridget of the mantles, Bridget of the hearth fire, Bridget of the twining hair, Bridget of the auguries, Bridget of the fair face, Bridget of the calmness, Bridget of the strong hands, Bridget of the kine, Bridget, friend of women, Bridget, fire of magic, Bridget, the foster mother, Bridget, woman of wisdom, Bridget, the daughter of Danu, Bridget, the triple flame, each day and each night I call for the descent of Bridget, that the power of healing be within us, that the power of poetry be within us, that the power of shaping be within us in earth, sea, and sky, and among all kindreds. Kindle your flame in our heads, hearts, and loins. Make us your cup, your harp, your forge, that we may heal, inspire, and transform, all in your honor. Brige, font of blessing. Bridget above us, Bridget below us, Bridget at every ant about us, and Bridget in our truest hearts. Tagama, it is well, my friends. thank you for joining me for this discussion. I either have time to take 2 or 3 questions or not.
We're over unless someone has does anybody have a question? We're just running up against our little lunch break, so.
Oh, righto. Well, I don't want to subtract from the lunch break.
Yeah, right.
All right. Well, thank you again to